Hi, peeps. You're listening to She's My Cherry Pie, the baking podcast from the Cherry Bomb Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jessie Sheehan. I'm a baker, recipe developer, and author of 4 baking books, including Salty, Cheesy, Herby, Crispy, Snackable Bakes. On each episode, I hang out with the sweetest bakers around and take a deep dive into their signature bakes. Today's guest is Jessica Battilana, the staff editor at King Arthur Baking Company and the co-author of the New York Times best-selling cookbook, The Big Book of Bread. The book is a literal baking Bible from the King Arthur team and was released last year. It's filled with 125 recipes for yeasted and naturally leavened breads for novices and advanced bakers alike. Jessica is also an award-winning food writer and recipe developer whose work has appeared in the New York Times, Food and Wine, and more. She's written her own cookbook and co-authored several others, and she's the co-host of the new podcast, Things Bakers Know, which debuts this spring from the King Arthur Baking Company. Jessica got her start in professional kitchens before shifting to food media. She joins me to talk about her new book and walks me through the recipe for cinnamon raisin swirl bread from the Big Book of Bread. Jessica and I chat about the importance of eating dessert every day and why it's a good idea to have cookie dough in your freezer at all times, and how working at a baking company has changed her cooking. I learned so much from chatting with Jessica, so stay tuned for our chat. Cherry Bomb's next issue is all about love, and I think you're going to love the cover. It features Ilona, Olivia, and Adriana Marr, the sister trio that has won everyone's hearts for their positive message of confidence and self-love. The issue is full of joyful stories and recipes. To snag a copy, head to cherrybomb.com or click the link in our show notes, or visit your favorite bookstore or culinary shop to pick up an issue. Let's chat with today's guest. Jessica, so excited to have you on She's My Cherry Pie and to talk cinnamon raisin swirl bread with you and so much more.
I'm so happy to be here.
I love to start interviews with early baking memories. It can be something you baked or a baked good that you ate that you remember. Can you tell us about one of yours?
Yeah, my mom was a fabulous cook, but not a great baker. She didn't love baking, but I always loved sweet things. Like I remember, eating the brown sugar out of the package and things like that. So I think because my mom didn't bake that much, I sort of took it upon myself to learn how to bake pretty early on. And the first thing that I remember baking was a brownie recipe from 17 magazine. And now I feel like my memory must be faulty because I'm like, did 17 magazine really publish brownie? Oh, wait, I haven't fact checked myself on this, but my recollection was that the brownie recipe was from 17 magazine. And I made that brownie recipe, I don't know, probably dozens of times. And so much that my family was like, okay, actually no more brownies. And then I started bringing brownies to the librarians because I went to the library a lot and, to friends. And I think I quickly understood the sort of power of a baked good to win people over. And so then I really got hooked. But I also remember messing those brownies up every which way, like always forgetting an ingredient or, it's like, it was like I think there is something to that. Like if you make the same recipe over and over again and you make those mistakes, you get very good at that one thing. So that's the first thing that I really remember baking. And I did say earlier, my mom was not a great baker, which is true, but we always had homemade birthday cakes throughout my childhood. There are 3 kids in my family. We all got to pick our birthday cake, and my mom made those from scratch, which knowing that my mom didn't love baking that much is really like a tremendous act of love.
I read also that not only did she make birthday cakes, were there also maybe popcorn balls? I read about popcorn balls, and I love a popcorn ball.
Yeah, she would make them for Halloween. A lot of these recipes she didn't write down, and I didn't make them with her. So I think they were pretty standard, like a molassesy, peanuts, popcorn, formed in a ball and then put in Ziploc bags. And I guess we would give them, I don't know if we would eat them, if we'd give them out. But yeah, I haven't thought about that in a long time, but those were quite good. I should make them for my own kids. They'd probably be into it.
Yeah, I think popcorn balls, they don't get enough love. Can you tell us about the imaginary talent shows that you would do in your kitchen when you were little in front of I guess it was like dark outside, so like in front of a window so you could see yourself in the glass reflection?
When we first moved into that house, my parents bought that house right before I was born. So in the fall of 1978. And the kitchen at that time it was carpeted, wall to wall, paisley, horrible. I mean, a carpeted kitchen is pretty much the most disgusting thing I can think of. And it was like that for probably the first 10 years of my childhood. The house it wasn't really put together right. It was a house from the 50s, sort of mid-century, which is very unusual for Vermont, especially at that time. But it had these giant windows in the kitchen, two sort of giant windows. And so the only way to orient the stove was like to push it up against the wall where it was with a window behind it. I used to cook things or bake things. In Vermont in the winter, it gets dark early. And so, by the time you're making dinner, it's pitch black outside. And so I could see myself reflected in the window, and I would just like do a little fake cooking show. Because we watched all of those. We watched the Julia Child show. We watched The Galloping Gourmet. My mom was into all of those. So I had seen food television, and I was just making my own little show.
I love it. And that was actually going to be my next question, because I'm realizing that a lot of my guests, some of their kind of early training or training in quotes or early inspiration was cooking shows. So was that a part of like where you were exposed to watching people cook, and obviously your mom was into it?
Yeah. I mean, we also didn't have cable. I mean, there weren't food shows on cable then, but it was all PBS. So it was like Marianne Esposito and The Frugal Gourmet. Yeah. And The Galloping Gourmet, The Graham Kerr, and of course, Julia Child. And then, years later, when I was sort of starting to get into food, my first job, I was living in Boston, and I got hired by WGBH. They were doing some retrospective of Julia Child, and the job that I was hired for was to watch all of the In Julia's Kitchen with Master Chef series and like annotate it. So like at minute 1, Julia sees whatever, and minute 25, she's making her béarnaise sauce. So I watched those videos. I mean, you have to watch them over and over to get that timing right. So I feel like those videos I have a very deep knowledge of and very strong memories of.
I want that to be my job.
It was great. It was great for a beginning cook because, right? I mean, those are like, if you want to be, a baker, a cook, In Julia's Kitchen with Master Chefs is like, it's a masterclass in cooking and baking.
I'm sure your mom had many, but did you have a favorite cookbook or maybe even a baking book that you loved when you were little?
It's funny. My mom had a big collection of cookbooks, but I don't remember her ever cooking from them. I mean, I'm sure she got inspiration from them, which honestly is really what I do now. Like I have a crazy, huge, ridiculous cookbook library, but rarely do I cook, straight from a cookbook. I read them sort of like novels and I get inspiration. And I think that was what my mom did as well. I mean, we had like all the standards, like the Fanny Farmer, Joy of Cooking, all of that. She did really like Florence Lin. It's a Chinese cookbook. And my mom really liked Chinese food, really liked to cook and eat Chinese food. So she cooked from that book a fair amount. And that, I think she followed the recipes because it was such a new cuisine for her that she, needed a little bit of help. But yeah.
Let's take a quick break and we'll be right back.
Hi, everybody. It's Carrie Diamond, founder of Cherry Bomb and host of Radio Cherry Bomb. Have you dreamed of visiting Las Vegas? Join me and Team Cherry Bomb on Friday, March 7th and Saturday, March 8th for a special series of events in Vegas. We're hosting a fun party in the Arts District at the acclaimed Velveteen Rabbit Bar. Think terrific cocktails and mocktails, tarot card readings, I will be first in line for that, and the city's best food trucks. Then Saturday at the Wynn, we have a special networking breakfast and panel conversations with some of the women shaking up the culinary scene. Then Saturday night, there's dinner at the brand new Jelena at the Venetian. Tickets are on sale at cherrybomb.com right now. You can buy tickets to the individual events or a weekend pass. We'd love to see you there.
Peeps, have you heard about Cherry Bomb's Jubilee? It's our annual conference for women in food, drink, and hospitality, and it's happening Saturday, April 12th in New York City. I always love being at Jubilee and connecting with other bakers, pastry chefs, and cookbook authors. If you'd like to join us, you can get tickets at cherrybomb.com. If you're an official Bomb Squad member, check your inbox for special member pricing. I hope to see you there. Now back to our guest. I wanted to jump ahead to your first cookbook, Repertoire, which, as you and I have discussed, I loved when it came out, and I still make the candy pork recipe from the book, which I highly recommend listeners make. And in Repertoire, you write that you're a recipe writer, but not much for rules. And I thought that was very, very true with savory cooking. I feel like maybe it's a cliche to say, but it's a lot more spontaneous. It allows a lot more wiggle room. But would you say that still is true? Working for a baking company, having written a New York Times bestselling cookbook about bread, would you say you still feel like you're a recipe writer but less rule focused, or do you feel like now rules have had to come into the foray a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I think rules have entered the chat.
That's a better way of putting it.
I think that's still true for my savory cooking, for sure. I think you can get away with a lot more. There's a lot more wiggle room, which is why I think some people really gravitate towards cooking and never bake, or really gravitate towards baking and never cook. And my co-authors, Martin Phillip and Melanie Wanders, who wrote the Big Book of Bread with me, they're real bakers. And so there is a sort of rigor to being a good baker. And rigor makes it sound negative. And I don't mean it to sound negative, but I think, you're going to get better results if you bake by weight, if you follow some guidelines. And so in some ways, I find it actually, especially the baking by weight, which is what I do exclusively now, to be quite freeing, actually, because you're not wondering, like, is it going to turn out the same way it did last time? Like, it frees up some of the guesswork, especially for bread baking, where I think there's other things that you have to guess at. So, like, let's not start with guessing whether or not you have the right amount of flour in the bowl. So, yeah, more rules. But within that, I mean, I do think bread baking in particular is both an art and a science. There is obviously the sort of tactical aspect of it, but then there is the intuitive part of it. And I think that's why I think it's a interesting and exciting challenge, even for bakers who have baked other things, because no day is the same. No dough is the same.
100%. Bread is so exciting. And in some ways, the rewards of seeing a loaf come out of the oven are like no other. You're a staff editor at King Arthur Baking Company. How has working for a baking company, would you say, changed your cooking, if at all?
I don't know that it has changed my cooking so much. I mean, I'm certainly baking more than I ever did before. And particularly, of course, like, the natural consequence of working on a bread book for 2 years is that you bake a lot of bread. I mean, I was an occasional bread baker before, and now I am a devoted bread baker. It is part of sort of like the ritual and routine of my home cooking life. So that has changed.
Would you say that means you still identify as a cook, but maybe also as a baker as well?
I think so, yeah. I think I sort of have a foot in both worlds, which is nice. Like, I like both things. I think they activate different parts of my brain. What is probably the most seismic shift for me is before I started at King Arthur, I joined the company 2 years ago. I had been freelancing for most of my career. And most of that time I had spent working on different cookbooks, my own cookbook, but then also co-authoring cookbooks with other chefs and bakers. I had a more flexible schedule too. Like, I was not sort of beholden to the 9 to 5. And so that was a change for me because I keep pretty, standard hours at King Arthur. And so I understood in a new and a different way, like that sort of pressure of like, oh, it's 5 o'clock. And now it's time to start dinner. And like, what are we going to do? Whereas when I was recipe testing and working on books, there was always something to eat because I would have spent my workday, making stuff. So that was kind of like a little wake up call for me of like, okay, well, what am I willing to do at the end of the day? And where can I fit things into a regular day? My co-author Martin talks about fitting bread baking into the cracks of your day. I love that expression. I sort of have taken that to apply to my savory cooking too. So, when I'm making my kids' lunches, I'm also grating cheese for dinner, or I'm salting the meat, or I'm mixing the bread dough because I don't have like huge chunks of time just to mess around in the kitchen the way that I used to.
Has bread baking become like a weekly thing now? Do you always have homemade bread at home?
We do, yeah.
Oh, that's so great.
It is great, and it's funny because I like to bake through a lot of the different recipes in the book and beyond. And my kids would like me just to make white sandwich bread every week. Thank you very much.
So cute.
It's just also delicious, and I'll do it. But yeah, when I try and branch out, they're like, "That's fine, but could you just
Can we have white bread again?" I want to get into the Big Book of Bread, but just before I do so, there were a couple of things that I read about you that I loved. First of all, that you're an ardent supporter of eating dessert every day. And you also say that when you were rating repertoire, your family was a dessert every night kind of family. And that's how I was raised. And I just wondered if, first of all, if the family is still now, I think when you wrote the book, your kids were pretty little. Now they're a little bit older. If that has changed at all. I think you also said you always have chocolate chip cookie dough in your freezer. I wonder if all of those sweets, which I hope is the case, are still around, or if you've kind of like, you're like, no, I'm a bread lady.
No, we're still a dessert family. We're still an ardent dessert family. I don't know. I mean, who knows what's going to happen tomorrow? It's like, you might as well have the dessert. Yeah, we do have dessert every night. And it's not always like a home baked dessert. I mean, don't get me wrong. It's not like I'm whipping up a cake every day. There is always cookie dough in the freezer, which I feel to me is like, it's like a security blanket, like no matter what happens. Well, I really sort of reached the zenith of my life when I moved here to Maine from San Francisco in 2020. And one of the first purchases was a chest freezer. And I just felt like I had arrived, So we have more freezer space. And so we always have cookie dough, or we'll have, we have ice cream. And probably once a week I'll bake something for us. Or if we have friends coming for dinner, I'll bake something. But we do like sweet things, which makes me well suited to my job. And, sometimes my wife hears me on a conference call and she's like, oh, another one of your conference calls about cupcakes?
Yeah. She's like, God, you have a hard job.
Yeah, no, it's hard to get a lot of sympathy.
You're really bringing home the bacon. All right, now I want to talk about the Big Book of Bread. The most wide-ranging bread book to be published in a decade is something I read about it. First of all, I have to say, in the week that it came out, it was the #1 New York Times best-selling book in its category. And that was so incredible, just having spoken to you and other King Arthur folks. And I knew that was, it's everybody's goal. But wow, you guys killed it, kicked it out of the park. So happy for you. But I wondered about this idea of the most wide-ranging bread book. And it's a gorgeous book. The most wide-ranging bread book to be published in a decade. For those that haven't seen the book yet, what can a reader expect from this incredible tome?
So it's broken into 6 recipe chapters: flatbreads, pan loaves, hearth loaves, which is where a lot, but not all of the sourdough recipes are, a chapter on buns, bagels, and rolls, a chapter of fancy breads, which are the enriched loaves. And then we have a chapter of things to make with bread. So when you have, leftover bits and bobs of bread, what can you transform it into? And then the book starts with a very robust sort of step-by-step technique section, because all of these breads essentially are using the same techniques over and over. And it was both a tactical choice, because if we repeated those instructions for every recipe, it would be like the big, big, big book of bread. It's already a very big book. But also this idea of like, master these skills because they're going to show up over and over again. And so if you spend some time reading that section, then you're going to be set up for everything that follows. And then we also included a section in the center of the book, sort of right at the heart, called a sourdough primer, which is, a guide to all things sourdough: how to start your starter, how to feed your starter and maintain that, and then bake with it.
Tell us about the collaborative process of developing the structure of the book, developing the recipes themselves. I think you wrote the head notes, but I wondered if you were the head note writer. And I also wondered, were you like the most experienced writer of the 3 and the other 2 were the more experienced bakers? Is that fair to say?
First of all, I should say that Melanie Wanders and Martin Phillip, who are also employee owners at King Arthur and wrote this book with me, are just wonderful. They're top humans. Like I really hit the jackpot working on this project with them. And I think as I have gotten older, I have seen how working in collaboration can be so much richer than working, in the sort of lone wolf way. And it was especially true of this book. Like we all brought our own skill set to the table. And so I have written the most cookbooks out of the 3 of us. Martin has also written his own cookbook, Bread Cookbook, which is essays and bread, and is a brilliant and beautiful book. But I have put together, I don't know, I think this is my 13th or 14th book. So I think in terms of like concepting, like what a book should be, what it should look like, what will make it interesting, I do have a lot of experience in that area. But, Martin worked in our bakery at King Arthur for, 6 or 7 years, every day, hundreds of loaves of bread. So he brought this expertise for bread baking that was tremendous. Melanie is in our research and development team, and prior to that was a pastry chef and ran a chocolate shop with her husband. And so she, when we're talking about the rigor, like God bless Melanie for just bringing that sort of like attention to detail, and commitment to just testing and testing and testing and testing until something was perfect. Well beyond the point that I was like, I think it's fine. Like, I think it's okay. And she would be like, just one more test. So I think, we were sort of like this three-legged stool, and Martin and Mel really developed all of the recipes. And then, I wrote all the rest of the copy in the book. And I often feel like in all of my cookbook collaborations, and in this one as well, I sort of am always waving the white flag of the home cook. Like, can they do that? How do we make sure they're successful? I was the least experienced bread baker of the three of us going into it. So I was waving that white flag a lot, just being, a lot of text between us, like, is this right? Is this what I should do? What about this? And I think that sort of exchange between the three of us, made the book better, made the recipes better, because I'm like, hopefully have asked like every question of the two of them and of, the other experts in the company that anyone at home would ever ask.
Once Mel felt like the recipe was in the shape she wanted it to be, did she send it to you for a final test? Like, did you test?
Yeah.
Have you made every recipe in the book?
I've made almost every recipe in the book. There are some recipes that Martin developed that Mel cross-tested. Mm-hmm. Most of the recipes that Mel developed, I cross-tested. And then, of course, our test kitchen team at King Arthur tested all of them because we love to test. That's another. That's the thing about King Arthur, too, is that people come to us expecting stuff to work. There's nothing more aggravating than getting a book where something doesn't work.
So now I want to talk about the cinnamon raisin swirl bread in the book. And what's amazing and special about this particular bread is that there are several versions of it, completely different flavor profiles, which I love seeing one bread recipe be able to become so many different things. It can become Mexican chocolate swirl bread, duca swirl bread, French onion swirl bread, and lemon swirl bread. Do you recall who came up with the idea for this swirl bread and its variations? I think it's so brilliant, and I feel like I haven't really seen it before.
I think collectively we were all like, yeah, swirl bread. Swirl breads are a thing that people get excited about, but you only really, most often only see a cinnamon raisin. And I would like to look back through the various books that I have done over my career, because I feel like this is sort of a conceit that I have teased out in other books too, where it's like you have this sort of foundational recipe and then you do some things with it that make it different. And I think that it appeals very much to me, but I also think it can be kind of eye-opening for cooks and bakers at home, and exciting too, to be like, oh, all I have to do is learn to make this one thing and then I can make all these other things. Like, oh, I learned to make pâte à choux and now I can make eclairs and profiteroles and, gougères. And yeah. So I think that's exciting to give people that sort of like, that foundational recipe. So I think together we were like, swirl breads are a thing that we want to dive into. And then it became an exercise of what flavors we will do. And I feel like we could have kept going. But early on, there was a prune swirl bread with like an Earl Grey streusel. There was a peanut butter jelly one that we messed around with for a while. There was a coconut one that we messed around with for a while. And we just, for various reasons, they got abandoned along the way. Some of them we couldn't get to work really well, reliably. Some of them we just thought were like maybe too fussy, and then of course we couldn't just do a book of swirl bread. So we had to sort of pick our favorites among the group.
So this bread is studded with raisins, and then it showcases this like gooey brown sugar swirl through its center. It's ultimate breakfast bread. I know it's an enriched dough. Just for people that may not know, what does it mean when someone describes a dough as enriched?
So an enriched dough, you think of like those soft, fluffy, delicious, sort of doughs that you've had in your life. They're likely fluffy and soft and delicious like that because they have some enrichment, which is just extra fat added. So in this case, the fat comes in the form of butter, which gets added to the dough, and also eggs. And you'll see that like that same challah might be enriched with butter or oil and eggs. Brioche, obviously lots of butter. And it gives that sort of like fluffy kind of pull apart texture that you see with like the best dinner rolls or the best breakfast breads. I'm glad we actually are talking about this recipe, because in every recipe in the book give options for making it with sourdough and making it with yeast. But with these swirl breads, we did. So there's an option to make it with sourdough culture or an option to make it with yeast.
The bread needs a stand mixer, and you guys sort of, state that and point that out. Is that because many of the breads you can make without one, and so you wanted to be clear that when you make an enriched dough, it's a stiffer dough, and you really, anybody could make it by hand, but you really want a stand mixer with an enriched dough?
Yeah, I mean, if you go to the gym enough, anything can be done by hand, I suppose. Like brioche and, like milk breads and all these were made long before the advent of commercial mixers. So it is possible. It just would be so annoying. But there are lots of recipes in the book that call for no mixer at all, that are hand mixed and just folded. Unless we felt like, oh, you really need a mixer, we tried to give options for both, doing it by hand or a mixer. But with the enriched doughs, I mean, it would just be so annoying.
I
to
also
do it by
learned, or it was expressed in a way that I had never read before, but this idea of, an enriched dough produces a really strong dough, and you need the strength so it holds its shape, you get a good rise, and the mixer gives you that. It's not just that it would be hard on your arm, it's also that that's actually the best product.
Exactly. I mean, and I think it's a number of things. Like this recipe has bread flour. So bread flour has, higher amount of protein. You get more gluten bonds to form. I think of it like the Rockettes, like linking arms, like you get a strong gluten formation, which supports a good rise in the bread, but you also have to develop strength in the dough. And so you can do that a number of ways. And we talked about in the book, like you can develop strength through time. You can develop strength through kneading on the bench by hand, or you can develop strength through mechanical mixing. It's like a two-pronged attack. It's like strong bread flour, a nice mix to give you a nice strong dough, which in turn in the oven will like support a strong rise. And because this bread has the raisins in it, you want that dough to be nice and strong so that it'll rise.
Suspend.
Beautifully.
Yep. So the leavening for this dough, as you mentioned, the dough can be made with a sourdough culture or it can be instant yeast. We're going to discuss the bread as if we had a sourdough culture. And I think you guys like it at King Arthur. You like it for its flavor and improved keeping qualities. Does that mean that a bread made with sourdough culture lasts longer than a bread made with I had no idea.
Yeah.
Sorry, Jessica was nodding, so I was. But yes, she says yes. I forget that people can't see us.
I know.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Also, we find that it, improves browning and just, really like flavor. You get this flavor development. And I think in this book, we sort of lay out the strategy. It's not a new strategy. We are not the only people to do this in the history of bread making or in the history of bread book writing, but this idea of building to bake. And I feel like this is a really important idea. And so I just want to take a minute to talk about it. Like, you'll see in other recipes, it'll say, ripe, fed sourdough culture. And there's a lot of talk about like, oh, I've got to catch my sourdough culture at the moment that it's at peak, right? And I think people get really bogged down by like, okay, it's going to peak in 8 hours and then I have to bake right when it's at peak. And so this idea of building to bake sort of frees you from trying to catch your starter at the exactly right moment, because what you do instead is you take a small amount of culture. So you don't need cups and cups of sourdough culture. You need, at most in this book, I think it's like 4 tablespoons of culture. And you mix that with a portion of the flour and the water in the recipe, and you let that sit. It's called a pre-ferment. That is essentially acting as another feed for your culture, helping to sort of rev it up.
I learned this way, and this is how I make sourdough. I learned this from tartine. You always make the pre-ferment. I always want to call it preferment. Pre-ferment. But don't you still need to catch that tablespoon or that 2 tablespoons when it's at the right spot when you make the pre-ferment?
You have a little bit more wiggle room,
okay, that's
which
good
is the
to
great
know.
part. So, would I say like take your neglected culture out of the refrigerator and throw it in and like hope for the best? Like, well, no, because, you think about your sourdough culture like an athlete, right? If you lay on the couch for a week and then you're like, let's go run a race. You're like, I'd really rather not. But if you are like, hey, let's just we'll go out for a mile every day and come back and, and then on Sunday, you're like, let's run 5 miles. You're like, I can do that. So can you take neglected, hooch covered starter from the back of your fridge and assume it's going to make your bread rise? Well, no, you got to give it a little TLC. But I don't think, with this building to bake, if you're catching it at the peak of ripeness or after it started to fall a little bit, you just have a little bit of a broader window there, which
really
I
good
think
to
is
know.
nice.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about the bread using the pre-ferment, but if you don't have a sourdough starter going, do not worry about it because there are directions in the recipe. You'll add a little extra flour, you'll add some water, and you'll add a little extra instant yeast. So you can go in either direction. Yep. So on day 1, first things first, we're going to soak some raisins in some cold water overnight in a small bowl or the night before you want to bake. Tell me why we need cold water.
You can do it in hot water too. It doesn't really matter, but you don't want them to get too soft and mushy. Like if you put boiling water on them, sometimes raisins can kind of fall apart. You're just trying to plump them up so you don't have like dry little nuggets in there. And also so they're not going to take moisture out of your dough.
Smart.
So if they're prehydrated, they're not like going in there thirsty thinking like, oh, I'd like to drink some of this dough water.
We're going to cover the raisins. Does it matter? Like a dish towel? Should I picture an airtight cover?
A plate, a little,
Great.
it doesn't matter.
And we're going to hydrate them at room temp for about 12 to 16 hours. And then in another small bowl, still on day one, we're going to combine our sourdough culture, which we've discussed is basically a little bit of your starter that you have on your counter that you've been building with water and flour for however many days or weeks or years at this point. We're going to add some bread flour. So we have a little bit of sourdough culture, a little bit of bread flour. And I wondered about this. I know the bread itself has bread flour. Why do we need the bread flour in our pre-ferment? Could we use all-purpose?
I mean, in theory, you could use all-purpose, but this pre-ferment is going to become part of your final dough. So we're looking for strength. So even though it seems like, oh, it's a separate thing and it's going to get incorporated and there's the majority bread flour, you don't want to weaken that by adding an all-purpose flour.
Yeah.
And also, it's nice just to have a recipe that calls for one kind of flour.
Yes.
Would your bread fail with a pre-ferment made with a quarter cup of all-purpose flour? I don't think so. But, I feel like we know with confidence that a stronger dough is going to be best case scenario here. So I say stick with the bread flour.
And we're going to add some cool water. Why does it have to be cool? Could it be room temp? Or do you not want it to get too speedy too fast? So you want to...
That's it. Yeah. You don't want it to get too speedy too fast because it's going to sit overnight. So if you really revved it up with warm water, it would move faster, right?
Yep. Now we're going to cover that again. Sounds like not a big deal. Piece of plastic wrap, plate, whatever you want. And let that stand at room temp overnight for about 12 to 16 hours. So you could do all of that maybe before, I'm just trying to think timing wise, maybe at the end of the day. 6
That's
p.m.,
what I do.
9
yeah,
p.m.
I'll do it, in the evening. And, Martin says he has a nice phrase to think about pre-ferments, which I think helps people sort of understand the purpose. He says it's like a bouillon cube of flavor for your bread. So just that little amount of pre-fermented flour and water is just going to give like a little flavor spike, which is a nice way to think about it.
Yep, little flavor bomb. On day 2, we're going to make our dough. So in our stand mixer bowl, we're going to combine the pre-ferment. So basically, pre-ferment is what we call the culture after we've taken it, added a little bit of flour and water to it. I love that, pre-ferment.
You could do your pre-ferment in your mixer bowl.
Mm-hmm.
If you wanted to save a bowl. I always want to save a bowl.
Yes, I'm a big bowl saver. That's a great idea. So do that pre-ferment in your stand mixer bowl. Or if you didn't, you're going to put your pre-ferment into your mixer bowl. You're going to add bread flour, a little bit of granulated sugar. Why the granulated sugar? For the instant yeast or for flavor and seasoning?
Yeah, all of the above.
Okay.
Yep, exactly.
And then we're going to add some fine salt. Why not kosher? I feel like we see kosher so much.
This is the nice thing, again, of baking by weight. If you're baking by weight, use whatever salt you want to use. It doesn't matter. As long as you're speccing to the gram weight in the recipe, you could use kosher salt. I don't use iodized salt. I don't recommend iodized salt in bread, but, you could use fine sea salt. We just use what we use in the test kitchen at King Arthur, which is a fine table salt, non-iodized.
Yep. Now we're going to add some instant yeast, which is my personal favorite, just because it saves a step, saves a little bowl. Is that the reason why you guys are recommending it?
Yeah, we have transitioned to exclusively using instant yeast in the King Arthur recipes, because it can be added directly without, blooming it before. So it just, again, streamlines it a little bit.
Yep. We're adding an egg, and I wondered, should the egg be room temperature, or is it not super important at this stage in the game?
Not super important, because this is going to mix for so long. Everything's going to warm up.
Yep.
But it doesn't hurt if it's room temperature.
And then we're going to add some warm milk. And we're going to use the dough hook attachment. We're going to mix on medium-low, scraping the mixer bowl as needed. My favorite King Arthur tool, and tool generally, is the plastic flexible bench scraper. Love that.
Love that thing.
So
I love
much.
It. It's a good,
So much.
Good stocking stuffer,
Yes, 100%.
Everyone should have one.
100%. So we're going to use our flexible bench scraper to scrape the bowl as needed, and we'll mix for about 2 to 3 minutes until we have a firm yet tacky dough. Then we're going to increase the speed to medium. And I wondered about this. I was interviewing someone about a gluten-free bread recipe, and she was saying that she never turns her mixer above medium when she's making dough in a stand mixer. And I said, oh, is that like a gluten-free bread thing? And she said, no, That's how I always make bread. I tend to put it to a little higher than that. Do you guys
Yeah,
have a
interesting.
position on speed? And if you don't, that's okay. But I just wondered, I tend to go medium high, but then I suddenly thought, am I making bread wrong?
No, I don't think you're making bread wrong. I wonder too, like it feels a little nebulous sometimes on a KitchenAid. Like what is true medium?
Right.
You know, that's interesting though. She said she only mixed on medium. There are definitely indications in this book where we mix, I think on medium high. I feel like for the brioche,
Maybe.
if I'm remembering correctly,
Yeah.
we mix that a little bit more vigorously.
Okay.
I was also going to say we talk about tacky versus sticky a lot. And tacky to us, we think about being like the back of a Post-it. Like that's
nice.
what.
Yeah.
Versus sticky is like, it's sticking in
Glue.
your hands.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or tape. So we're going to continue mixing on medium until the dough's smooth and elastic, an additional 3 to 5 minutes. And then with the mixer still on medium, we're going to add some room temp unsalted cubed butter. We're going to do it one piece at a time, mixing until the first piece is fully incorporated before adding the next. Continue mixing until the dough pulls away from the sides of the bowl and is soft, smooth, and elastic. 3 to 5 minutes. And again, we're scraping periodically with our dough scraper, or is this don't really need to?
I don't even think you need to at that
Okay.
point, because really the scraping is just to make sure there's no dry bits. And by the time you're mixing there, all the ingredients should be incorporated. So you're just building strength.
So now we're going to drain our raisins, and with our mixer stopped, add the raisins. Then we'll mix until evenly distributed, 1 to 2 minutes more. We're going to cover our stand mixer bowl. Don't even take it out at this point. Is that correct? And just let it rise at room temp until doubled in size, about 1 to 1.5 hours. Again, I don't know why I'm so obsessed with covers, but are we covering it with anything? Cover it with a plate, we're trying to seal
you want
in?
to cover it airtight at this point because, you see a lot of, I hate no shade to anyone's grandma who covers with like a kitchen towel. You see a lot of that, but that is not an airtight cover, and you're trying to prevent air from getting to the dough, because what happens, and I'm sure if you are a person that covers your dough with a cloth, you may have seen in the past, like sometimes you pull it out and then it's got like a skin on it, which is not ideal because it's a drier exterior. And so you're going to have some dry bits in your dough that then when you go to like mix it all together or shape it are going to be obvious, right? Like they'll be obvious.
I think it can also preclude your rise, because once it has that dry kind of surface, the yeast is trying to bang through it and it can be a little funky.
Yeah, so we advise plastic wrap. If you don't want to use single-use plastic, that's fine. You can get, as long as it's a reasonably tight-fitting plate or a beeswax wrap, like any of that is fine.
Meanwhile, we're going to make our filling. So in a small bowl, we'll combine some light brown sugar, some bread flour, and some cinnamon. Same question as before. Could we put AP in? I'm not saying people would, but I just like to understand choices.
Yes, in this case, you could. You do need a little bit of flour, and we learned in extensive testing, one of, I think, the big problems that people have with swirl breads is the gapping.
Mm-hmm.
Like you swirl it up, you've done your best, it looks good going in, you take it out of the oven, it looks beautiful, you cut into it, and it's like your spiral's not holding together. And so we did everything we could to solve for that. Some of that is in the shaping, which we will talk about later, but a little bit of flour there sort of acts as glue for the other filling ingredients and sort of helps glue those spirals together. So it has a reason that it's in there, not just for extra flour.
So we're going to grease an 8.5 by 4.5 inch loaf pan, which, in case anyone wants to know, that is my ideal loaf pan size. I do not like the 9 by 5s. I just love how sexy and slim, the 8.5, the King Arthur particularly.
And straight sides.
I love those straight sides and those sharp corners.
I
know. We're all obsessed with straight sides. It's like a thing, and we need T-shirts. And we're going to spray with cooking spray, which I loved because being trained in a bakery, that's what I use exclusively to grease. Was that a choice? Could you use butter? Could you use oil? Is it what you guys do?
You definitely could. I just think it's the cooking spray. I know there's, you might have some, and if you have some reservations about aerosol spray, you could grease otherwise, but it's very convenient, and it doesn't burn the same way that, butter would burn in a pan. So that's sort of our default recommendation. And that 8.5 by 4.5 straight-sided pan, I feel like it sets you up to have a beautiful looking loaf of bread.
It's the best. So now we're going to lightly flour our work surface. You have us using bread flour. Sorry, I keep going back to this. Could we do it with all-purpose flour?
Why do you hate bread flour so much, Jessie?
Maybe I just want to say bread flour so much. No, I just want to understand. Because I know.
No, you could flour the surface with all-purpose flour.
I'm just always curious when I'm making something and it has a particular flour. Can I pull out AP now? Or should I stick? So that's why I keep asking you.
Yeah, for shaping, it would be totally fine. I think, when we were writing the recipe, it's like if you have a bread recipe that is I think most people have all-purpose flour plus other flours, but we were like, well, what if they don't? What if they've just bought bread flour
Yeah.
to make this recipe? And then they're like, oh, now I need AP for dusting. Like, but yes, if you have AP and you want to use that for shaping, dusting this work surface, totally fine.
So we'll lightly flour our work surface. Then we're going to use our plastic bowl scraper to ease the dough out of the bowl onto the work surface. We're going to gently deflate the dough. What does that mean? Do you mean like punch it? Do you mean like just press it lightly?
Sometimes I see on the internet now, people are like so aggressive with they've gotten their dough like nicely risen. It's like, it's bubbly, it's happy. And then they come in with their fist and are just whacking it right in the middle. I mean, I get that we all have aggression to work out. Like, I think the point is here, you're just trying to get the big bubbles. Like you spend all this energy and time to get a rise in your dough. So you don't want it to completely knock it out. Like you want it to have some air in there. So you're just looking to kind of flatten it out, address any big bubbles, because those will become bigger bubbles as it proofs, and just give yourself like a nice level surface to work at. But you don't have to like punish the poor dough.
So we'll gently deflate our dough. Then we're going to roll it into a 15 by 8 inch rectangle with the shortest side facing us. Do you have a favorite rolling pin? Do you like one tapered edges? Do you like one with handles?
For this one, I don't have the ball bearing type. Mm-hmm. I only have a straight pin, and then I have one with tapered ends. Mm-hmm. And for this, I don't think it really matters because my tapered pin is long enough that I could get, it's longer than 15 inches. But, the ball bearing ones will work fine. And this isn't such a big piece of dough that you have to worry about overlapping your rolling pin. I will say, though, there was probably a time in the past where I'd be like, it's close enough. Like, it's probably 15 by 8, and I wouldn't actually measure it. But now, like I have a ruler in the kitchen and I use the ruler. It's important to set yourself up for success by like starting with the right dimensions and not just guessing. I mean, I do like to guess for other things, but in this case, it's like, don't guess, actually measure that it's 15 by 8.
Now we're going to brush a light, even coat of egg wash, which I love is made from egg and salt, which is the same way I make my egg wash, over the dough. And we're doing this, I assume, so that the filling will stick to the dough. It's like glue.
Exactly. Just a little glue. Yeah.
And we're going to sprinkle the filling evenly over the dough, leaving about a 1 inch wide bare strip on the short side of the dough that's farthest away from us. I thought this was interesting because I've been comparing this base recipe to all the other variations. This was one of the recipes where we actually don't even press in the filling. Some of them we actually have to press to adhere, like the French onion. Here we don't have to. We're kind of sprinkling it all over the egg wash and it sticks.
There's not a lot of volume to it, unlike some of the other ones. So
right.
Yeah, it'll just stick right on.
Now we're going to fold the outer ½ inch of each long edge to sort of enclose the filling. And I assume this is to ensure it doesn't leak while baking.
Exactly.
And then we'll gently press down those little edges that we folded over. And then starting with the short side that's closest to us, we're going to roll into a log. Is the goal very tight?
I'm glad you asked because no, I would have thought before we did 1 million tests of these breads, like if you want your swirl bread to stick together, like roll tighter, right? And so that was what I had always done. And I had always had gappy swirl breads. So you actually don't need to roll it really tightly. You want to give a little breathing room so that as the dough rises, like there's a little bit of sort of space between the swirls so that it has a place to go, right?
Yep.
Like, because it's going to go somewhere. And if you really cinch it up tight, like it will force the swirl apart. So just roll it. Don't like give it the business. Just sort of like roll it away from you gently.
Now we're going to pinch the center seam closed, and then we're going to pinch each end to seal, which is interesting. I have never done that with a swirl bread, like closing up those ends. Is that, again, to protect against leakage?
Exactly. And sometimes I do sort of like a karate chop on the ends, like I just put the sides of my hands, I'm showing you and nobody can see this, but I put the sides of my hands like down on the ends of the dough, just to kind of flatten them. And then I just tuck them under. So you don't have to go crazy pinching it. It's just trying to get like a nice tight little parcel.
We're going to place the log seam side down in our prepared pan, and then we're going to cover again. This time when we're covering, we don't want anything flat on top of our pan because we want a 1 inch rise above the pan. So are you kind of draping?
Shower caps to the
rescue.
Shower cap.
Okay.
Shower cap. If you go to a hotel, I mean, most hotels still give them out. And I've never worn a shower cap in my entire life, but I do take them because they're great. You can buy, bowl covers too that are reusable, but for a free option, shower caps are great. They're perfect because they are tight, they have a tight elastic seal, but they allow room for the dough to expand. And if you have to cover with plastic wrap, that's okay too, but I would spray one side of the plastic wrap with cooking spray and put the sprayed side against your dough, because we've all had it happen, where your dough rises and then it bonds to the
I've had it
plastic
happen.
wrap.
Yeah.
So
I've had
many
it
times.
happen in the bowl when you're making sourdough, and then
Yeah.
you pop it out and there's like some piece that sticks to the fabric that makes me
And
ballistic.
deflates the whole thing.
Oh,
And
I
Yep.
can't even go there. It'll make me too sad. But anyway, okay, we're covering with our shower cap that we got it at a hotel. We're going to let the loaf rise at room temp until it crowns about an inch over the rim of the pan, about an hour and a half. Towards the end of the rising time, we're going to preheat our oven to 350. We'll lightly brush the top of the loaf with that reserved egg wash and sprinkle with turbinado sugar, which you're giving us a choice, but I'm just telling everyone, please sprinkle, because that just sounds so delicious and yum.
Yeah.
And then we'll bake the bread until the crust is golden brown. The internal temp is about 190. It's going to be about 40 minutes. Do you guys believe that the best way to test your bread is temp? Is that ideal?
I think it is one tool in the toolbox.
Yep.
I think that certainly no professional baker who's baking hundreds of loaves of bread is temping every single one to see if it's done. It acts as sort of like a secondary confirmation of what your eyes tell you, right? I mean, I think if you're baking, and this is important, like baking to full color is maybe our rallying cry for this book, like actually bake till something is GBD, like golden brown delicious, really get some color on it. Then, you don't really have to worry about the inside being done. But I think there is sometimes a tendency, especially with newer bakers, to do like a pale bake, light bake, which is not as flavorful. Like brown is the most delicious color, but also, then you might run the risk of not having it baked all the way through. So you could have the temperature checked to.
That also is like a pet peeve of mine with pie, because people
It's the
want it to
worst.
look a certain way. And so they pull it when it's golden brown. I'm like, no pie is ever done at golden
No.
brown.
I mean, honestly, if that's the only thing people ever learn from this podcast, Jesse, we will have succeeded. Like,
Exactly.
bake to full color.
Yes.
Just really go for
Yes.
it.
I've said this before, so listeners, if you've heard this, I apologize. But I once heard Carla Hall say exactly what you just said. This was at a pie contest. There is flavor in the brown. That is where
Yeah.
your flavor is. So we're going to remove the loaf from the oven, turn it out of the pan right away and onto a rack. This helps the bread come out of the pan easily, preserves the crunchiness, and because if you keep it in the pan, it's like a little steam oven and it can get
Exactly.
soggy. And then we'll let cool completely before slicing.
That's the worst part.
Is the waiting.
Waiting till it cools. Yeah.
So there are a number of other variations. I just wanted to go through them quickly so people get a sense. There's a dukkha filling, which is like an Egyptian condiment of crushed nuts and spices. And you have us toast fennel seeds and coriander, cumin until fragrant. And I love this, 1 to 2 shades darker than when you started. And I feel like that's a great visual cue to this point about color. Then we're going to add some toasted hazelnuts, pistachios, and sesame seeds, pulse it all together. I love this too. We're adding a teeny bit of egg wash to this nut mixture. Before we might have added a little flour to help with our cinnamon raisin filling. Now we're adding a little egg wash so it helps keep our spiral together and almost to the consistency of like a wet sand.
Exactly. Yeah. Again, it's sort of like the gluing it together.
Yeah. And
I
this
love
is
that
one where we're going to, once we've brushed our dough with the egg wash, we're going to press down to adhere the filling. I went through every single recipe just to confirm that there are no modifications to the dough. And there really aren't. This dough
No.
works. The only modification I saw, even with fillings, the Mexican chocolate filling, for instance, and the cinnamon raisin, and maybe the lemon as well, you don't have to press to adhere the filling. But other than that, all of the directions are the same. With our Mexican chocolate, we're adding some mini chocolate chips where we added those raisins, and then we're adding some sugar, cocoa powder. I wondered, I'm like a big Dutch process obsessive. Is it Dutch process cocoa powder?
Yeah. Dutch
Yeah.
processed cocoa
Yeah,
powder.
the
Exactly.
color, it's not only flavor, but the color is so beautiful.
Yeah.
And you want that dark, I imagine. It looks beautiful when you see that.
Yeah,
really
you get that dark
cocoa.
spiral, and it has
Yeah.
a little bit of, cinnamon and spice in it.
Yeah,
sort of
chipotle
intense.
powder, cinnamon, salt. So yummy. Again, not adhering. And then this one is so special. The French onion filling with
That
caramelized
bread's
onions,
crazy. It's
and
so good.
cheese, and fragrant thyme. I thought this was interesting. To avoid any gaps in this swirl with the French onion, you need to caramelize your onions deeply and you need to grate your cheese finely.
This is another one that we really tested a lot because we were having gapping problems with this. And so we give a measurement for how much onion you should have after they actually get roasted in the oven. it's hands off, but you really need to cook them for a long time. And I can't remember off the top of my head how much the final measurement of it, but it's sort of shocking.
it's 35 grams. It's a quarter
It's
cup
35
at the
grams.
end. Yeah.
So you really are cooking it down. And we actually added that measurement sort of later in the development game because we had folks saying like, yeah, I've cooked the onions long enough, but they would end up with like,
Big
a cup of onions or something, or, like they just weren't taking them far enough. And then, yes, like the moisture from the onions would cause gapping. That bread is so good. I can't wait to make like this winter. I'm going to make French onion soup, and then I'm going to make the French onion bread, to use as the raft on it, like a double French onion.
So good. I also wonder if you could almost, it's a little more labor intensive, but almost, well, maybe it wouldn't be, but almost make like a pull apart bread with it. Yeah, just cut, rather than roll the bread up once you put down the French onion, cut it into squares and then put it. I think that could be just the
I
whole
wonder
thing.
you could do like a monkey bread sort of situation with it.
Yum.
Sort of fun.
Yum. So we'll mix together that finely grated Gruyere with those onions. And this is one where we're going to press to adhere since it's a thicker filling. And then the last is the lemon swirl bread, which I love this. This is, I think, is from your head note. It's a zippy bread, and it's great for breakfast. I love zippy. It's a gooey swirl of zest and sugar, and I love this, too. It tastes like curd, despite the fact it's only like a tablespoon of zest, which is pure baking magic.
It is baking magic.
Right?
I don't know how Mel did it, but it's like it gets gooey in this really wonderful way. The sugar and the lemon zest, it gives you and it has a little bit of flour in that mixture. It just like gives the impression of lemon curd. That's a special bread. I like that one a lot.
Well, thank you so much for chatting with me today, Jessica. And I just want to say that you are my cherry pie.
Oh, geez. Thanks so much for having us.
That's it for today's show. Don't forget to follow She's My Cherry Pie on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen, and tell your pals about us. You can find today's recipe at cherrybomb.com. She's My Cherry Pie is a production of the Cherry Bomb Podcast Network. Thank you to Good Studio in Brooklyn. Our producers are Carrie Diamond, Catherine Baker, and Jenna Sadu. Thank you so much for listening to She's My Cherry Pie, and happy baking!